She meant to be neighborly. She ended up being unforgettable. The fence post was crooked, and I knew it, and I'd been meaning to fix it since March. That's where she found me. Not dramatically, not at some moment of crisis or consequence. I was kneeling in the dirt with a digger bar across my thighs, looking at the post's angle and calculating whether it was worth the effort to pull it and reset it, or whether I could get away with another season's lean. The ground was hard. It had been a dry fall. I was 63 years old, and my right knee had been giving me grief since August, and the last thing I wanted to do was drop that post and dig the hole another 6 inches. She came riding up the south draw on a gray mare I didn't recognize, wearing a canvas coat that had seen better weather, hat pulled down against the wind. She stopped about 20 feet off and looked at me kneeling in the dirt, and she said, "You're Holt Greer." It wasn't a question. I said I was. She said her name was Ruth Calloway, and she'd bought the Denmead place 6 weeks ago, and she was sorry she hadn't come over sooner. There'd been a lot to do. She had a voice like she meant what she said and didn't feel the need to decorate it. No upward lilt at the end to make everything a question. Just, "This is what I know, this is what I'm saying." I asked if she wanted coffee. She said she had about an hour, so yes. That was October, first week. The cottonwoods were yellow, and the air had that particular smell it gets out here before the cold really sets in, dry grass, and something faintly mineral, like the ground itself is thinking about frost. I don't know what I thought about her in those first minutes, except that she didn't look around my kitchen the way some people do when they come in, cataloging the disorder, the single coffee mug on the counter, the pile of tack on the chair that had been there since summer, the dishes from breakfast still in the rack. She just sat down and put her hands around the cup I gave her and said, "The Denmead well is pulling sand." We talked about wells for 20 minutes, casing age, sediment depth, what it cost to have someone out to look at it versus what it cost to wait too long. Then fence lines and the legal situation on the south boundary, which had been in some dispute between the Denmead estate and a family to the west for years before she bought in. Then the state of the county road between our properties after the fall rains had gotten into the gravel. She was practical, and she asked specific questions, and she had already done some homework because her questions weren't the vague ones a newcomer asks, the ones that show they don't quite know what they don't know. They were precise. She wanted the answer to this specific thing, not a general orientation. She drank her coffee, stood up, thanked me, and said she'd be in touch about the fence line question. Then she rode back south and disappeared into the draw. I stood at the window and watched the gray mare go, and I thought, well. Then I went back to the post. I want to tell you something about what I was, in the years before Ruth Calloway came out of that draw. I had been alone for 4 years. My wife Margaret passed in the spring of, it's been 4 years now, 5 this coming March. I lose track sometimes in a way I didn't used to. She had a cancer that moved fast once it got started, and we had 7 months from diagnosis to the end. And in that 7 months we did what we could, and said what we needed to say, and got our affairs in order the way people do when they've been married 31 years and learned to work together on hard things. It wasn't a good death, but it was ours, and we were in it together until close to the end, and that counts for something. After she was gone, I went through the ordinary stages. The collapse, which for me looked like just doing the work and not sleeping enough and not eating right for about 6 months. Then the slow reassembly, getting the sleep back, getting the meals back, getting a routine that held me through the day. My daughter Cora flew down twice that first year and tried to make me talk about things, and I talked about things as best I could, and then I was as right as I was going to be. Except what I reassembled into was something quieter than what I'd been, smaller in a particular way, not diminished exactly, more like contracted. The way a fire goes down to coals and gives off less light but still gives heat. I got the work done. The cattle, the land, the equipment, the 100 daily tasks of a working ranch. I kept the place up. I ate. I went into town on Fridays and bought what I needed and talked to whoever needed talking to and came home. I called Cora on Sundays and we talked about her kids and her work and her husband Dale, who was a decent man. Pete Lasseter, my neighbor to the north, waved from his truck when we passed. The boys at the feed store knew my order. The woman at the post office knew my box number. Everything was smooth and familiar and managed. And what I didn't realize, what I couldn't see from inside it, was that I had become, somewhere in those 4 years, a man that people managed around rather than a man they actually saw. Not because people were cruel. The people in this valley are decent, but a widower of a certain age who lives out a dirt road and doesn't make noise about himself becomes a fixture. Holt Greer is out there. He's fine. He gets the work done. He manages. You wave at him on the road. You nod to him at the feed store. You don't lean on him or draw him into things because he seems to prefer the quiet, and you respect that. What they were respecting was a version of me that had calcified, a shape that looked like a man going about his life. And I had gotten so accustomed to the outline of it that I stopped noticing there wasn't much inside anymore. I didn't know I was waiting for anything. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't sitting there pining or longing. I was just living, the only way I knew how to live. Getting through the days, most of them fine, some of them less fine, none of them unbearable. Ruth Calloway had no idea about any of this when she rode up that October morning. She came because the Denmead place shared a fence line with mine, and she was a practical woman who believed in knowing your neighbors. She wasn't there to save me. She wasn't there for any reason particular to me. She came because she needed to know about the well and the fence and the county road. Which is maybe why it worked. She wasn't looking at me through the lens of grief or widowhood, or what I used to be or what I ought to become. She was looking at me because I was the man who knew the ground she'd just bought, and she needed what I knew. She came back 2 weeks later with a post-hole digger on the back of her truck, and a question about whether I knew the location of the survey marker on the southeast corner of her property. I did. My father had shown it to me when I was 9 years old, and I'd walked the line half a dozen times since. I told her I'd take her out there, and she said good, and we drove out in her truck, which was older than mine by several years, and had a cracked windshield and a baling wire fix on the passenger door handle that was clearly her own work. The truck smelled like horse and diesel, and a little like the cedar chips you put in a feed room against mice. We walked the line together, maybe 1.5 miles of it, and I showed her where the markers were, the rusted iron pipe at the cottonwood on the draw's edge, the chiseled stone by the dry creek, the concrete monument at the corner with its brass cap still mostly intact. She had a small spiral-bound pad in her breast pocket, and she wrote things in it as we went, and she asked questions that were specific and grounded. She'd ranched in Montana for 30 years before she came south, her husband's place, up near the mountains, more water than we get here but harder winters. She knew what she was looking at. Her questions weren't coming from ignorance. They were coming from the position of someone who had knowledge and was expanding it, one piece of ground at a time. I found that easy to be around. Most people who ask questions are asking you to give them a general map so they can feel oriented. Ruth was asking for particular coordinates. On the walk back she said, without any build-up, "The Denmead boys let this fence go to hell." I said they had. The youngest one had been sick his last few years, and the others had been in and out, and nothing had been maintained the way it ought. She said, "I've got about 4 days of work on the worst sections. I could use a second pair of hands if you've got time to spare. I'll work the same length of your south line in trade." I said I had time. She said, "Wednesday then." "Early." I said early was fine. She nodded and drove off down the road in the cracked windshield truck. I walked back to the barn and stood in the doorway looking at nothing for a minute. There was something in me that had shifted, very slightly, like a stone that was almost but not quite balanced. I couldn't name it right then. Something like being consulted. That was the closest I could get. Wednesday was cold and bright. The kind of fall day that looks warm from inside and isn't once you're in it. She was at the gate at 6 sharp, truck loaded with posts and wire and tools, and we drove out to the worst section of her south fence without much talk because there wasn't much that needed saying. She worked hard. Not with the kind of demonstrative hard work that's really a performance, the exaggerated grunts and sighs, the pointed display of effort. She worked the way a person works who learned to work young and has been doing it long enough that the effort and the motion are one thing. Steady, methodical, no wasted movement. She had a good eye for a level post and a strong back, and she didn't ask for help with things she could do herself, which I respected. We didn't talk much through the morning. Some things about the work, this section of soil versus that one, the better depth for the clay patches, the gauge of wire. But mostly we just worked. I noticed things, the way she wrapped wire, the particular way she set her weight when she was tamping a post. The fact that she wore the same canvas coat but had traded the hat for a wool cap because of the low branches on that section's tree line. She had good hands, the kind that have done a lot of work, not dainty, not rough for roughness's sake, just capable. Around noon, she reached into her saddlebag. She'd unsaddled the gray mare and let her graze on the long rope, and pulled out 2 sandwiches in wax paper and held one out to me without asking what I wanted. Roast beef and mustard on dark bread, with some cheddar that had been there long enough to get a little sharp. Good mustard, the real kind, not the yellow stuff out of a plastic bottle. We ate standing, looking out across the flats. The light was good that time of day, everything sharp-edged, the shadows short and defined. I could see from where we stood, the north edge of the ridge and lower down, the line of the draw and the roof of my barn just barely. She said, "What's that draw called? The one going north from your property?" I told her it was called Greer Draw, which was not what anyone had formally named it, but what it had been called since my father's time. His father had run cattle in that draw in the early years and the name stuck. She said, "Your family's been here a while." I said since 1887. My great-grandfather had come out from Nebraska with 2 other families, and most of them had left within 10 years. The drought of the 90s broke a lot of those early homesteads, but mine had stayed. She looked out at the draw and the ridge and the sky beyond it. She said, "I envy that." Not the land, was what I understood. The knowing of it, the long time with one piece of ground, the accumulated knowledge of a place that takes decades to build, that lives in you in a way you can't read from a map or learn from a previous owner's notes. The way I knew, without looking, that the northwest quarter of my pasture holds water 3 weeks longer than the rest after rain. The way I knew where the ground went soft in a wet April and where it stayed firm. Things you can only know by being there, year after year, watching. She envied that, the rootedness, the accumulated time. I thought about it for the rest of the afternoon while we worked, the word she'd chosen, envy, not said lightly. We finished her worst section by 4 o'clock, and she said she'd be at my south line Thursday morning to start the trade. I said she didn't need to rush it. We could spread it over the next 2 weeks if that worked better for her. She said a deal was a deal, and she'd be there at 6. She was at my gate at 6:15 on Thursday. She brought coffee in a thermos that time, which I hadn't expected, and she poured 2 cups before we started and handed me one without making anything of it. Just the sensible thing to do on a cold morning. The coffee was stronger than I make it, better. We worked through the morning and into the afternoon, and at some point, I couldn't tell you when exactly, there wasn't a moment it started, I realized I'd been talking. Not about anything significant, not at first. About the land, which sections held up in a wet spring and which ones turned to soup. Where the deer came through and at what season, the particular draws they used coming down off the ridge, the fence crossings they'd been using so long there were worn patches in the ground on both sides. A limestone formation on the western ridge that I'd always called the Cap, because of the way a flat sheet of rock jutted out over the slope like a brim, and how I'd meant for years to look up its proper geological name, and never had. She listened, not in a polite waiting for you to finish way. Actually listened the way you listen when you're filing something away. When I mentioned the deer crossing, she asked which direction they ran in September versus November, because she'd been seeing sign on her east fence and wanted to know if they were coming through from my side. When I mentioned the limestone cap, she said she'd seen it from a distance and had wondered the same thing. She wanted the information. She was receiving it as information. Nobody had wanted my information in years. Margaret had known all of it already, which was its own thing, a different and deeper thing, the knowledge built together over decades. But Ruth was new to this ground, and everything I said was knowledge she didn't have, and she received it with genuine attention, like it was worth having. I don't know how to explain what that did to me. It sounds like nothing when I say it plainly. A woman listened to me talk. That's a small thing. But there is something that happens to a man when he goes long enough without being listened to, not years, even just months, even just a season of it, where he starts to preemptively edit himself. He starts sentences and trails them off. He reaches for the particular word and then settles for a vaguer one because he's not sure anyone's waiting for the particular one. He stops going to the bottom of what he knows because the bottom doesn't seem to be of interest. I had been doing that without knowing it. She asked around mid-morning what we'd run on the place when I was younger, before I took over from my father and in my own early years. I told her the whole account. Sheep first, because my grandfather had believed in sheep, and then my father had switched to cattle in the late 40s when the wool market went soft and never looked back. The years my father had run both, trying to hedge, and why it hadn't worked, the practical reasons, the labor and the fencing and the way the two animals compete for the same grass if your acreage isn't large enough to give them separate runs. The herd numbers at peak, in the good decades. The bad winter of 1993 that took 30 head and nearly broke us. The ice storm that came in fast, and the cattle that got caught on the ridge and couldn't be reached for 3 days. She asked about the ice storm. She asked what the ground looked like afterward, what the conditions had been that let it set up so fast, how I'd gotten to the survivors. Specific questions that showed she was tracking it, not waiting. I gave her the full account, the real one, the one with the numbers and the bad decisions in it. The mistake I'd made about which pasture we'd moved the herd to in November that put them closer to the ridge than they should have been. The 2 years after that, we'd spent paying down the emergency note we'd had to take to restock. She said, "You pulled it back." I said we did, Margaret and I both. It was the hardest 2 years of the ranch, but we got it back and then some. And in the end, the herd we rebuilt was better than the one we'd lost, because we'd been careful about what we brought back in. She said, "That's a hard thing to do." I said it was. She let it stand there, didn't reach for more, didn't soften it or elaborate it or turn it into a lesson. Just, "That's a hard thing to do," acknowledgement without ornamentation. I noticed the weight of it. We finished my south line on Friday. 3 days of solid fence work, and the south boundary of the Callaway place and the south line of mine were in the best shape either had been in years, and we were square on the trade. I drove home Friday evening and cooked a meal, a real one, not the scratch-together kind I often made for myself, and ate it sitting at the table and thought about the 3 days. The conversation, the particular listening quality she had, the way she'd asked about the ice storm like she actually wanted to know what it felt like to be in one. Saturday morning, I went into town. I told myself I needed a few things, which was true enough. But I also went to the mercantile and bought a good 2-pound bag of coffee, the dark roast in the sealed bag, because she'd brought the thermos twice, and I'd given her nothing, and that was off balance, and I didn't like it. And I walked past the candy display and bought a 1/2 pound of black licorice. I'd seen her pull a piece from a bag in her coat pocket the first day we'd worked, when she thought I wasn't looking. She hadn't offered any and she hadn't mentioned it. She'd put it in her mouth and gone back to work, which meant she didn't have much and she liked it enough to keep it private. I drove over to the den mead, to Ruth's place, and knocked. She opened the door and looked at the box I was carrying and then looked at me. I said it was to square up for the coffee. She said that wasn't necessary. I said I knew that. She took the box. She looked in it, the coffee first, which she nodded at. Then she saw the licorice and she went still, just for a second. The way a person goes still when something unexpected happens that isn't bad, just not what they were braced for. She said, "How did you know I liked licorice?" I said I'd noticed. She looked at me, not long, not dramatically, a clear, straight look, the kind that's actually taking something in, adjusting an internal picture. Then she said thank you quietly and meant it and asked if I wanted to come in. I did. We sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours. She had the wood stove going, and the place smelled of the cedar chips she kept in the corner and fresh bread she'd baked that morning. And she cut 2 slices and put butter on them and set them on the table without asking. We talked about her place, what she was planning for the spring, how she was thinking about the herd numbers she'd inherited from the den mead sale, a question about the water rights that her lawyer was still working out. Then we talked about other things, her daughter in Billings, the particular nature of learning a new piece of ground after decades on the same land, whether it was harder to leave a place you'd built or a place that had been built for you. She was funny in a dry way, not joke-telling funny, just a precise, slightly sideways way of saying things that caught me off guard. She said something about the den mead water rights situation that made me laugh, and I hadn't expected to laugh, and the laugh came out louder than I intended, and she looked pleased about that. In the same restrained way she seemed to do everything, not a grin, just a slight easing of the face. I drove home in the late afternoon, and the light was going golden on the hills, and I felt, I don't know, full. Like something had been filled that I'd stopped noticing was empty. November came, and we fell into a thing that neither of us named. She'd appear at my gate some mornings with a question about the county road commissioner, or which vet she should be using for cattle versus horses, or what I knew about the family that owned the section to the east, and whether they'd ever sell. I'd answer and we'd end up at the kitchen table for an hour. Other times I'd find a reason to go over there. A section of galvanized pipe I had extra that she'd mentioned needing, or I'd spotted a section of her east fence from the ridge that needed attention and thought she'd want to know. We'd work together a while, and then stand around talking longer than the job required. I started looking for the reasons. I won't pretend I didn't. We ate supper together twice in November. Once at her place, she cooked a beef stew that was better than any I'd had in years, heavy on the pepper, the way I like it, and I didn't know if that was coincidence. And once at mine, where I made the only thing I made reliably well, which was chili and cornbread. Both times the food was plain and neither of us dressed anything up. Both times we stayed at the table past dark and were startled when one of us finally looked at the clock. I don't know what she thought about any of it. She was a private woman, not in a damaged or closed-off way, but in the way of someone who has learned to hold herself and doesn't need to fill every silence. I was the same way or had become that way, and so we operated in a particular register. Things were said when they needed saying, silences were comfortable, nothing was pushed. We didn't discuss what we were doing or what it might mean. We just kept doing the thing. What I knew was this: I had started thinking about the next time before the current time was over. On the drive home from her place, I was already looking at the week ahead, calculating where I might have a reason. The pipe I'd mentioned, the question about the east section, something. And I knew that a room in the house of me had come back on. I'm not sure how else to say it. Things I hadn't been noticing for years had come back into focus. A good sunset over the ridge, the particular way the frost lay in the creek grass, the sound the cattle made settling in the evening. Not because anything had changed about those things, but because I was tracking the world again the way you track it when you're planning to tell someone about it. When there's someone to tell. The first week of December, she had trouble with a heifer. Bad presentation, calf coming wrong, rotated, and her hand Dwayne was in town, and not answering his phone, and the mare was already lathered and she was out of time. She rode to my place at 2 in the morning and knocked 4 times, not pounding, just steady, the way someone knocks when they're urgent but not panicking. I was up and dressed, and in my truck in under 5 minutes. We worked that heifer for an hour and a half. The barn was cold, and the smell of it, the specific complicated smell of a barn in labor trouble, was something I knew from 100 nights. Ruth was calm throughout. Not performed calm, not the kind of calm that's covering up panic, but the functional calm of someone who has done difficult things in difficult conditions and learned to keep the useful parts of themselves available. She did what needed doing without flinching. When I needed an extra hand, she was there. When I needed her to hold the heifer's head, she held it. We got the calf turned, got it out. It was alive, which in that situation is not guaranteed. The heifer came through too. She was on her feet inside 20 minutes, already investigating the calf in the tentative way of a first-timer who hasn't quite processed what's happened. Ruth and I stood back from it, both breathing hard, the steam of our breath mixing in the cold air of the barn. The calf was on its feet, wobbly, insistent, the way newborns are, operating entirely on instinct. Ruth watched it and then she laughed. Once, short, real. The kind of laugh that comes out because something good happened that you were afraid wouldn't. I went to the sink to clean up. The water was cold and I was glad of it. She brought towels, good clean towels, not rags, and we stood there in the yellow light of the barn, and when I turned around to take the towel she was looking at me. She said, "Thank you, Holt." She said my name with a particular weight. Not affectionate, not soft, just weighted. Like the name meant something to her, like she'd said it enough times in her own head that it had acquired significance. I said it was no trouble. She said, "It's 2 in the morning." I said, "A neighbor shows up." She looked at me steadily, that adjusting look she had, then she said, "You're a good man." She said it the way you'd say the posts are level or the water table is at 40 feet. A statement of fact she had arrived at through observation and was reporting without decoration. Not a compliment designed to make me feel something. A conclusion. I didn't know what to do with it. I said something like, "Well," which is what I say when I don't know what to say. She handed me the dry towel and we went back inside, and she made coffee, real coffee, not the late-night thin kind, the same strong roast she always made. And we sat at her kitchen table until 4 in the morning because neither of us could sleep after a night like that. And somewhere in that long, cold conversation, she told me about Montana. The real version of Montana. The hard years when the water was short and the cattle market was soft, and they'd come close to losing it twice. The winter her husband had been sick, and she'd run the whole place alone for 8 months, and what that had taken out of her. What she'd loved about the place, the particular light on the mountains in the early morning, a thing she'd never seen anywhere else. What she'd felt leaving it, after Marcus died and the kids were grown, and the place felt too large and too remote for one person, and she'd made the decision to sell and come south where the winters were lighter and start something new. She told me the real version, the one with the difficulty in it. I told her about Margaret, the real version of that, the one I hadn't told anyone, not Cora, not Pete Lassiter, not the pastor who'd come to see me in those first weeks. The particular character of the grief, which wasn't what I'd expected. I'd expected the absence to be the hardest part. It was the silence that was the hardest part. The ranch had always been a 2-person conversation, stretching back 30 years, and when half of that conversation stopped there was a quality of quiet that I hadn't been able to account for. She listened to all of it without rushing me or tilting it or trying to redirect it somewhere more comfortable. Just let it be what it was. Outside the dark was still full. The heifer was settled in the barn. The calf was alive. Christmas came. Cora drove down from Portland with Dale and the 3 kids, June and Thea, and the youngest, Miles, who was 4 and who had decided this was the year he was interested in horses. The house was loud and full and chaotic in a way I'd forgotten I liked, and I spent 4 days watching Miles be terrified of, and then deeply fascinated by my 2 horses, and listening to June and Theo argue about everything, and cooking large meals that Cora insisted on helping with even though she'd always been a better eater than a cook. On Christmas Eve, after Cora and her family had gone to bed, I drove over to Ruth's place. I had a bottle of good whiskey, and I left it on the porch with a note that said Merry Christmas and signed my name, and I didn't knock because the hour was late, and I didn't want to intrude on whatever her Christmas Eve was. There was light in the windows and I could see the shape of it, the warm rectangle of her lamp, but I left the bottle and drove home. She called the next morning, Christmas morning, when I was drinking coffee in the kitchen while Cora made an elaborate breakfast she'd been planning since Portland. She said thank you and that it was a thoughtful thing. I said Merry Christmas. She said Merry Christmas. Then she asked, in the same practical way she asked everything, whether I'd want to ride the ridge with her the day after my family left, whenever that was. I said they were going on the 26th. She said the 27th then. I said the 27th was good. They left on the 26th at noon, Cora's van disappearing down the county road with Miles waving from the back window at the horses. I stood in the yard for a minute after the van was gone, the way you stand after company leaves. The house behind me suddenly quiet again, but not in the old way, in a new way. The quiet with somewhere to be on the 27th. We rode the ridge the morning of the 27th, first light. 4 miles up and along the top and down the far side, the whole valley white below us, the snow from the week before still holding on the north-facing slopes. The horse's breath came in long plumes and the cold was a clean, dry cold, not the wet cold that gets into your bones. We didn't talk much on the way up. There wasn't much that needed saying. At the top, where the ridge opened out and you could see east as far as the sky was clear, we stopped and let the horses rest. The whole valley was laid out below us, her place and mine, the county road between them, the dark line of the draw, the glint of water where the creek still ran open. From up there you could see the logic of it, the way the land was organized, the way the 2 properties fit together along their shared lines. She looked at it for a while, then she said, "I'm glad I came here." I said I was glad too. She said I wasn't sure when I bought the Denmead place. It was a lot of change. A new state, new ground, nobody knowing me and me not knowing anyone. She paused. It's been easier than I thought. I waited. She said, because of you mostly. She said it simply, without drama or softness, just the plain statement looking out at the valley. The same way she said a deal was a deal, and a neighbor shows up. I kept my eyes on the valley and felt something move in my chest, not overwhelming, just present, the way something you'd thought was finished makes itself known to still be there. I said, "You've done me good too, Ruth." She said, "I know," not arrogant, not assuming. She said it the way she said things she'd arrived at through observation, she'd been watching, she'd made the assessment, and she wasn't going to be coy about having made it. We came down off the back side of the ridge and put the horses up and stood in my barn in the afternoon light. The cold outside was settling in earnest as the sun went down, and the barn held its warmth from the animals better than the open air did. She was close. The barn was small and we'd come in together, and we were both reaching for the same rack to hang the bridles. She put her hand on my forearm. Set it there, easy, the way you set something down that belongs there. Not a gesture towards something, just a fact. I put my other hand over hers and we stood there a while, not looking at each other, looking at the horses, the barn around us, the last of the light through the gap in the door. That was all. That was enough. Neither of us needed it to be more than it was. I am 64 years old now. I have been on this land my entire life except for 3 years in the service and 2 years in Laramie when I was young, and thought I might want to live differently, before I came back and understood I didn't. I know this land the way you know a thing you've been in relationship with for 60 years. Not perfectly, not without surprise, but deep. I have cattle and I have the work of the place, and I have Cora who calls on Sundays, and Miles who has decided he's going to be a cowboy, and who I intend to take seriously on that point. I have the ridge and the draw and the limestone cap that I still haven't looked up the proper name for, though I've thought about it more lately. I have Pete Lassiter to the north who waves from his truck. And I have a woman on the next property over who comes through the south draw 2 or 3 times a week. She drinks her coffee at my kitchen table and talks to me like what I say is worth hearing. She asks the real questions, not the ones that keep things comfortable, the actual ones, and she waits for the real answers. She noticed without my telling her that February was the hard month for me, the month closest to when Margaret died, and she started showing up more often in February. Not with condolences or with attempts to draw me out of it. Just showing up. Being at the gate with coffee. Bringing something to work on. She brings me black licorice now sometimes, from the good candy shop in town. She sets it on the table and doesn't say anything about it. I eat it and don't say anything about it either, and we both know what we know. I want to tell you one more thing. She didn't come here for me. I mean that precisely, and it matters. She came here for the land and for the change, and for the life she was building after her own grief. And she meant to be neighborly because she was a practical woman who believed in knowing who bordered her. She came over that October morning because she needed to know about the well and the fence line and the county road. She didn't come looking for anything to do with me. But she came, and she sat at my table, and she came back, and she worked beside me on those fence lines in the cold, and she listened when I talked about the land. And she brought the thermos twice before I thought to bring the coffee, and she noticed I'd been watching her eat the licorice and that I'd liked it but hadn't said so. She looked, that's all, but she looked at me the way people had stopped looking. Like there was something worth looking at. I didn't know that was what I'd been needing until she gave it to me. She came by this morning, first light, before the frost had lifted off the flats. She tied the gray mare to my post and came in and poured her own coffee. She's long past asking. She knows where everything is, and sat down across from me, and said there was something wrong with the culvert on the county road, and she thought it was going to be a problem in the spring, and did I know anything about the easement situation on that section, and who was responsible for maintaining it. I told her what I knew. She wrote it in her little spiral pad. Then she looked up and found me looking at her. She said, "What?" I said nothing. I said I was glad she bought that place. She looked at me for a moment, then she went back to her notes. But she was almost smiling. I could tell. Not a full smile, that wasn't her way. Just the slight easing of the face, the small light in it. I know what that looks like on her now. I've been paying attention. Outside the window, the frost was burning off the low places in the pasture, the way it does in the mid-morning when the sun finally gets above the ridge. The day was going bright and clear, the good kind of cold day, and I had work to do, and she had work to do, and we'd be at it until dusk. And I thought, this is what it is to be a man who has been given back something he didn't know was gone, not handed back, given, by someone who didn't owe it to him and chose to anyway. That's the difference, and the difference is everything. I don't have a way to say it better than that. That's the whole story. There is a thing I haven't told you yet, something that happened in February, the second month of that year. I want to tell it because it's part of the story, and because it's the moment, if I'm being precise, when I understood that what was happening between us was something I hadn't had a name for and maybe didn't need one. It was the 11th, a Thursday. The anniversary of Margaret's death is the 14th of February, which has always struck me as the kind of detail that life arranges without consulting you about whether you find it appropriate. For 4 years I'd gotten through the 14th the same way, by working straight through from before first light until after dark and going to bed too tired to sit with it. It worked well enough. That year, the 11th, I was coming back from the northeast pasture on the tractor and the hydraulics went out on me. Not catastrophically, not the kind of failure that requires a call to a dealer and a week's wait, but the kind that requires attention and that I could fix myself if I had the parts in the afternoon. I didn't have the afternoon. I had 3 other things that needed doing before the light was gone, and the hydraulics were the thing I could defer, so I deferred them. I got home at dusk, fed the horses, came inside. Made something for dinner that I couldn't tell you now what it was, and then I sat down at the kitchen table and I didn't get back up for a while. Not crying, nothing like that. Just sitting. The particular weight of the week before the 14th has its own quality, and that night it sat on me in a way I hadn't been able to outrun. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the kitchen to get cold. I hadn't lit the stove. There was a knock at the door. I got up and answered it, and Ruth was there, standing in the dark with the truck running behind her and her breath in clouds, holding a covered dish. She'd cooked. She said she'd had too much stew for one person and thought I might want some. She said it plainly, with the same undecorated voice she used for everything. Then she looked at me in the doorway in the cold dark, and she saw whatever was on my face. She said, "When was it?" Not when is it, when was it? She already knew there was something. She wanted the specific fact. I said the 14th. She nodded. She handed me the dish. It was heavy and warm through the cloth she'd wrapped it in. She said, "You should light the stove." Then she said goodnight and walked back to her truck and drove down the road, and her taillights went around the bend at the cottonwood and were gone. I stood there in the doorway a moment. Then I came in and lit the stove and ate her stew, which was the same stew she'd made in November with the black pepper in it, and I sat at the table in the warmth and ate every bite of it. She came by the 14th too. In the morning, before I'd started working. Knocked, came in, poured coffee, sat down. She didn't say anything about what day it was. She talked about a problem with her tack room door and asked if I knew of a good carpenter in town. I told her about a man named Elray Fitch who did good work and was reasonable. She wrote his name in the spiral pad. She stayed an hour. When she stood up to go, she paused at the door and she said, in that matter-of-fact voice, "You're not alone in this valley, Holt." Then she went. I think about that sometimes. The precision of what she said. Not, "I'm here for you." Not, "You can call me anytime." Not any of the things people say that are kind but that don't quite land. Just, "You are not alone in this valley." The simple geographic fact of it. She was on the next property, and she was paying attention, and she was not going to pretend she wasn't. That was the moment I understood. March brought the mud season, and the mud season brought the kind of work that has to be done in it regardless, which is miserable work, cold and wet, and every piece of equipment caked, and everything taking longer than it should. I had a section of the creek bank that had undercut badly over the winter and needed addressing before the spring runoff made it worse, and I spent 4 days on it, 2 of them in rain. Ruth came over on the 3rd day, a Saturday, and helped without being asked. She'd seen the truck down by the creek on her ride and come to see what I was at, and then just gotten off the horse and gotten into it with me. We spent 6 hours in the mud, and the rain moving riprap and cutting brush, and laying the filter fabric, and she didn't complain once, and she was good at the work, practical and intuitive about where the water wanted to go and how to redirect it. At the end of the day, we were soaked through and muddy to the knees, and she was standing on the bank looking at what we'd done, and she said, "That'll hold." I said I thought so. She said, "For a while anyway. Creek's going to want to take another run at it in a year or 2. I said it would. They always did. She nodded at that, accepting it. The way she accepted most things, without bitterness about the fact of them, just with the clear intention of dealing with them when they came. We went back up to the barn, and I found her a dry shirt from the stack I kept in the tack room for situations like this. A ranch shirt. Nothing fancy. And she changed without ceremony and wrung her wet shirt out at the sink and hung it over the stall rail. We drove up to the house, and I made something quick, eggs and the last of some sausage. And we ate it at the kitchen table while the rain came down outside and the windows fogged with the warmth of the stove. She told me about the spring she and Marcus had lost their whole hay supply to a barn fire. 20 tons of hay and the barn itself, early April, just before they'd need it. The year had already been dry and they couldn't replace it locally at any price, and they'd had to sell down the herd at the worst moment. She talked about it with the same practical remove she had for hard things, not without feeling, but not indulging the feeling either, letting it be what it was. I asked what they'd done to get through it. She said, we worked, both of us from dark to dark, and we didn't let ourselves think past the next week. If you think past the next week when everything's on fire, you can't function. She paused. Marcus was good at that, staying in the week. I said Margaret had been that way too, the one who kept us in the week when I wanted to catastrophize about the year. She looked at me across the table, not with pity, with recognition, the look of someone who has been in the same longitude of experience and knows the landmarks. She said they were good partners. I said they were. We were lucky, she said. Some people never have that. I thought about what she meant by lucky and whether it was luck exactly or something more particular, a kind of grace that comes to certain people, maybe the ones who are willing to work for it in the day-to-day way, the 1,000 small daily commitments that build the thing over years. I didn't say any of that, but I thought it. April, the spring came late, but it came. The pastures greened up slowly, the way they do after a dry winter, testing the ground first, and then all at once. The creek ran high for 3 weeks from the snowmelt and then settled back, and the new fence work I'd done on the south line held through the high water without moving. I rode the whole property line on a Saturday morning in early April. Partly because I do it every spring to see the winter's damage. Partly because I wanted to see where we were, the two of us, Ruth and I, in the combined shape of the fence work. Her section and mine. 4 days of her work and 3 days of mine, and the whole south boundary in better condition than it had been since probably the mid-'80s. I thought about how she'd known which section to tackle first, the way she'd read the land that first day we'd walked the line together and made accurate assessments of what was urgent and what could wait, the spiral-bound pad with her notes in it, the post-hole digger in the back of her truck. She'd come here knowing what she was doing. She'd built something real in 8 months, out of a neglected property and her own hard work and good judgment. And she'd done it while also, somehow, paying attention to a man on the next place over, noticing his months, noticing his silences, noticing what he'd taken off her shelf and not said anything about. It's a particular kind of person who can build something for themselves and still have enough attention left over to look at what's happening next door. Not a saint, not someone performing kindness, just someone for whom seeing what's in front of them is the natural way of moving through the world. I sat on the ridge on that April morning with the spring laid out below me, and I understood very clearly that I had been seen. Not saved, not rescued, just seen by someone who looked at things honestly and without agenda and had looked at me the same way. That was enough. That was more than I'd had in a long time. May, she had a birthday in May. I didn't know the date until I heard it by accident from the woman at the post office who knew everyone's everything. The 22nd. I drove past her gate on the 21st evening and thought about it, and then I turned around and went back. I knocked and she opened the door and I said, "I heard it's your birthday tomorrow." She looked at me with the slight narrowing she did when she was deciding how she felt about something. Then she said, "News travels." I said it did. I said I didn't have anything for it, but I wondered if she'd want to ride the ridge in the morning. She said, "What time?" I said, "Before the heat." She said 5:30 then. I said 5:30. We wrote it at 5:30. The whole thing, top and back and down again, and the morning was clear and the light came up gold over the east hills and lit the valley from the bottom, and we didn't talk much but we didn't need to. Somewhere on the back side of the ridge, she said, without context, "This is a good way to spend a birthday." I said I thought so. She said, "Most of them aren't particularly." I asked what she meant. She said, "Birthdays when you're older, they get heavier, you add them up." She looked ahead along the trail. "But this one's light." I didn't say anything, but I took note of it. Summer came and the heat with it. The hard, flat heat of a dry July that kept you to the mornings and the evenings. We worked in the early hours and let the middle of the day be what it was. She'd bought a solar pump for the east tank, and it worked better than she'd expected, and she was pleased about that in her restrained way. I helped her install a corrugated shade structure on the south side of her barn, a half-day's work, and she brought out sandwiches again the same way she had that first autumn: roast beef, dark bread, good mustard, without asking. Some days I'd see her from the ridge, down on her property, moving, a figure in the canvas coat, or in summer, a lighter jacket, doing whatever she was doing. Sometimes she'd look up as if she knew I was there and wave once. I always waved back. One evening in late July, I was sitting on the porch watching the heat leave the hills, and she rode over without particular purpose. She said she'd been wanting to see the creek since the water had dropped and could she ride my side of it. I said of course. We rode the creek together in the last of the evening light, maybe 2 miles of it, the water low and clear and the willows thick on the banks and swallows working the insects above the water. She didn't say much. She watched the creek. On the way back she said, "It's a good creek." I said it had been a good creek for a long time. She said, "Your great-grandfather had a good eye." I said he'd been lucky with where he settled, but he'd also read the land right, had picked this valley over 2 others because of the water and the shelter of the ridge. She said, "Smart man." I said that was the family story, anyway. She said, "The land proves it." We got back to the barn and she tied off the mare and looked at the sunset, which was doing something complicated and orange over the western ridge. Then she looked at me. She said, "I want to say something." I said, "All right." She said, "I know what this year has been for me. I know what you've been in it. I'm not going to make it into more than it is or less than it is, but I want you to know I know." I stood there for a moment, the weight of it settling. I said, "I know too." She nodded. That was enough for her, that was enough for me. She untied the mare and swung up and rode back south in the last of the evening light, and I stood in the yard and watched her go. That's the rest of it. That's the whole of what I've got to say. I am 64 years old. I have a woman on the next property over who sees me, who walked a fence line with me and listened to me talk about the land, and noticed I'd eaten a piece of licorice, and showed up at my door on the 11th of February, and rode a ridge with me at 5:30 in the morning because it was her birthday, and she wanted to spend it somewhere particular. Who stood in my barn on a December night and said, with no decoration at all, that I was a good man. Who said I was not alone in this valley. Who said she knew what I'd been in this year for her and said it plain. She came here to be neighborly. She had no intention beyond that. She wasn't looking for me, and I wasn't looking for her, and the whole thing grew up from nothing more than a shared fence line and a question about a survey marker. But she looked. She just looked, and what she saw when she looked was me, the real one, not the fixture, not the managed-around widower, not the outline. The man who knew this land and had kept it and made mistakes on it and pulled it back and loved it for 60 years. She saw that man and she talked to him and she came back. That is the story. A woman who meant to be neighborly, who ended up being unforgettable. The frost is gone for the season now. The pastures are green and the creek is right and the cattle are where they should be. There's a gray mare tied to my post this morning. The coffee's on. I don't need more than this. I haven't needed more than this in a long time. I'm just glad I know it now.